Today on episode number 604 of the Teaching in Higher Ed podcast, Peak Higher Ed, AI's Possible Futures with Bryan Alexander.
Produced by Innovate Learning, maximizing human potential.
Welcome to this episode of Teaching in Higher Ed. I'm Bonnie Stachowiak, and this is the space where we explore the art and science of being more effective at facilitating learning. We also share ways to improve our productivity approaches so we can have more peace in our lives and be even more present for our students. Today, I'm joined by futurist Bryan Alexander, whose work has shaped how colleges and universities around the world think about emerging trends, technological change, and what's next for higher education. Bryan is the author of Academia Next and most recently Peak Higher Ed, and he leads the long-running Future Trends Forum. In this conversation, we look squarely at just one of the many forces that Bryan examines in Peak Higher Ed, artificial intelligence. This is a force that's shaping not just our classrooms, but the entire social and geopolitical landscape in which higher education now operates. Bryan helps us widen our lens, consider the multiple futures that might unfold as AI both inflames and inspires our work, and shares candidly about his own experiences as an educator. Bryan Alexander, welcome back to Teaching in Higher Ed.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. It's wonderful to be here.
I am both so delighted to talk to you again, but I'm also scared because I want to start out with something that feels sensationalist to me. And you know, Bryan, this is not a sensationalist podcast, but you did write it. So I feel like, you have to be safe with it. So I'm going to quote an X exchange from February of 2025, but I want listeners to know if this feels like, what on earth? This is uncharacteristic of teaching in higher ed. It's only going to take about 15 seconds and it all makes sense in a second. So hang on to your hats, folks. All right, Bryan, are you ready for me to quote?
I'm ready.
You probably already know what I'm going to quote. So Parker Luckey, this is a post on the social network X. Parker Luckey writes, "What will happen in broader academia when clear scientific consensus is that AI-assisted education delivers better outcomes than 3.8 million teachers currently do?" And Bryan, who is it that responds to Palmer Luckey?
And that would be one Elon Musk.
And he says, that is already possible. I ask you, Bryan, how are you analyzing all the different ways that AI is inflaming and yet in other cases inspiring higher education in all the complexity therein?
Well, thank you for picking out that quote. I'm glad it stuck with you. It really hit me when I first read it, and I think it embodied quite a lot. Before 3 years ago, I was paying a lot of attention to AI. I wasn't writing a lot about it, although I wrote a chapter about it in a previous book. But when ChatGPT 3 really took off, then I devoted more and more time to it. And I've been thinking more and writing more. I have a whole Substack series just about AI. And it cuts across higher education in so many different ways. I mean, you could think about, for example, a strategic question: how should an institution, complicated organization like a research university or a community college, how should they grapple with this new technology? It's a technology that in many ways is more slippery, more fast moving, just simply more vast than many other previous technologies, say compared to Wikipedia or the mobile phone. You can think about questions of pedagogy. What are the positive ways that we can interact with? How can we use generative AI to produce simulation? How can we use it to enhance student experience and student voice versus the problems of what does this do to the beneficial friction of struggling with writing or with thinking through a problem, much less the great unsolved problem of what do we do with assessment? And we can look at the problem of how do we actually figure out what people are doing with AI within post-secondary education. That's a really great challenge, because if you poll people, they have all kinds of great incentives to not respond accurately. If you ask somebody, are you using ChatGPT or using any AI, they have the incentive to say no because it might appear to them to be a kind of, unpleasant or unpopular or awkward technology, or they want to seem cool and tech savvy, and so they'll overstate their use of it. It's like asking people, about their use of alcohol or their sex habits. On top of this is the question of how do you structure a university or college's response? Does it become something that, say, a chief information officer takes charge of, or a chief online learning officer if they have one? Should this be a provost's job? Should you hire someone to be an AI manager or AI evangelist or AI vice president for a campus? Is this something which you need a special advisory group for? I mean, is this as urgent and as challenging and as complicated as we confronted COVID-19 5 years ago? It needs that kind of its top whole of enterprise response, or is this something that is overblown and overhyped, and we should expect it to fade after a big market correction and bubble? So we should be ready to pick up the pieces in a few months, and then this should just be something for the chief of IT to worry about. I mean, the issues go even further and further still. The proponents of AI in the world outside higher education are sometimes very political. They might be very libertarian. They might be Republican. The Republican Party right now is largely, not entirely, but largely very pro AI. Trump is. Project 2025 was. I mean, there are Republican opponents to AI like Josh Hawley, but on campuses, a lot of the opposition to AI cast themselves in a very progressive political way. If people are viewing AI as bad, having bad labor practices, as reinscribing social problems, social injustices, and so on. So it really hits higher education on so many different angles and domains. I mean, in this book, I focused everything on one chapter because I really wanted to get as much of the current set of issues on it as possible. But it's not the only issue impacting higher ed, so it had to take a seat alongside all the other ones too.
You write, some argue we're on the verge of something like utopia, while others warn of disaster or utter human extinction. How do we even start to think about these issues and particularly using a futurist's lens or set of lenses?
Well, that's a great question. And if the audience hasn't seen some of these, I'd recommend for the utopian side, my go-to text is Vinod Khalsa's piece called AI Dystopia or Utopia, which is one which argues for AI is utopia. And he's interested and biased. He's an investor in AI, but it's a very thoughtful piece in terms of trying to create a maximum AI is beneficial technology view. And you can go further still to science fiction. I'd strongly recommend the Ian Banks series called The Culture, which has a future humanity lorded over and sustained by attentive and kind AIs. For the dystopian side, I mean, it's easy to find pop culture versions. Everyone likes to go the Terminator. I'd say instead go back to Colossus, the Forbidden Project. But I think you can find many other views that consider this to be dystopian. I would say Mahabali's views, through her blogs, and her talks, you could find that. But also taking a look at, for example, the Great Paper, which declared the stochastic parrot model. And there are other views. Brian Merchant, for example, in his Blood of the Machine Substack, gives a very great argument about AI as this nightmarish machine on many levels. As a futurist, I bring to bear a few different tools that we have in the futurist toolkit. One is just simply practice that futurists have been thinking about AI since really the 1960s. And you can find references to it from writing from then on to the present. So we've got some ideas. We can rely on some of our practices like environmental scanning, which is a pretty explanatory term, but just going through the present day, looking for evidence of certain stories and uses, and then compiling them and trying to determine what kind of trends come out of that. I do a bunch of that work. But you can use other tools as well. One, for example, is to try to produce scenarios of where this could take us. And I give 4 different scenarios like that along those lines in peak higher education. And another is to do workshops and interactions with people, which is in many ways the best. So to give an audience, like thinking of an audience, but as a group of participants, giving them a challenge. For example, on the Future Trends Forum, we had a challenge of redesign the college and university of today, assuming AI as it now stands. which is a fascinating prompt. Think about, well, do we need sports? What happens to tenure? What kind of governance structures do we need? How do we fund all this? Should there even be a college? All these kind of things. And again, another two bits of this. One is that we try to be as open to as many possibilities as we can. I think of this as the range from utopia to dystopia, so that we don't end up just leaning towards one or the other. And beyond that, to try to get as much different input as possible. So to hear from proponents and critics, to hear from people in the global north, the global south, to hear from people across the disciplines, the humanities and the sciences. And so that often churns up a lot of the way I work.
You do offer us a caution, which I love both what you just said, but also that I may be ahead of some listeners in having read the book and knowing that you live up to the spirit of that through and through, not just this book, but through your work. That is what informs your sense of purpose and mission, and that's very consistent. But you still do offer us a caution against believing all the hype, like not just going down and buying into all of that utopia beliefs. What informs your caution on that particular front? What should we be aware of?
Well, I have a whole series of cautions, and I guess I could add one more part to the futurist toolbox, and
Sure.
this is a bit more controversial, which is to think about science fiction, because imaginative fiction has been thinking about AI for quite some time. Arguably the first great AI story is Frankenstein, if you will, and we have many examples that give us ways that AI could go wrong. I pay a great deal of attention to critics like Helen Beetham and Cory Doctorow, trying to think about some of the different ways that AI could cause human harm or misfire. There's the macroeconomic possibility of it being in a bubble. Ed Zitron, for example, writes these incredibly long newsletters about that. And that has a couple of problems. One is just taking down the amount of investment, both financial, but also investment in time that people are using in AI. But also the problem that a lot of the U.S. economy is now riding on AI. It's in many ways, depending on how you measure it, a big chunk of our economic growth. So if AI is bubble, if it turns out to be a bubble and it pops, this might be bad news for the entire economy. But also thinking about what this means within higher education, thinking about the possibility of the classic industrial era move where an enterprise switches workers for capital. So we're going to take out humans who do various things from staff functions and faculty functions and replace them with AI. That's one thing that I'm very leery about, especially if it's done in a cruel way and doesn't lead to a net increase in employment. I'm worried about the pedagogical problems that may result. Do we have, for example, cheating that just occurs at scale because we have no real good way to stop it or dissuade it? And in which case, do we get a lot of students who go through the higher education experience and get very little out of it? And then does that degrade the reputation of higher education outside of the academy? And also, I just have students who lose the what's some called the beneficial friction, the beneficial struggle of wrestling with complicated stuff in higher education that for us is part of how we do learning. So if someone is trying to fight through the many thickets of organic chemistry, for example, or they're working through an experimental novel for the first time, they can turn to AI to smooth the way, but does that smooth it so much they actually don't learn anything? Um, I'm cautious of this. I'm cautious of the way that AI can reproduce problems in its data set, which is the internet. Ian Bogost once said that we should think of AI as an instrument that plays the internet, which I've always liked. My friend, the late leader of CNI, Cliff Lynch, said that for him, and artificial large language models were basically a remix machine, remixing its data set. And I'm very persuaded by those accounts. But in doing that, in having that kind of remix happen, then we can remix and re-include and reinscribe, reinforce all kinds of biases on multiple language, on multiple axes, thinking about biases by language, by geography, by religion, by race, by gender, by ideologies of all kinds, and so on. I'm also very worried about the labor aspect of this. Like a lot of businesses, I worry that they have bad labor practices. Are they outsourcing moderation? Are they outsourcing work to people that they pay very badly and support very badly? And in a sense, for me at least, looming above all of this is the question of what is the impact of the large language model on climate change? To what extent do large language models drive up electricity demand and cause us to use more electrical power, which means that, and in responding to that, we slow down the decarbonization process and give new life to, say, coal or natural gas. And to what extent does our large language models use too much fresh water? And fresh water is a problem in much of the world. So I think about all of these issues as they impact and shape the world around higher education, but also as they hit higher education itself. And I don't think we can cleanly separate the academy from the world. I think these global issues are part and parcel of what we do.
I want to share two quick anecdotes. And my risk in sharing them quickly is that they'll lose their nuance. Both of these
Mm.
people, I appreciated the interaction we had. The first was someone who I did not know. She came up to me after I gave a keynote and did a workshop at a university more than a year ago. And she said she really enjoyed the game that we played. I've created this card game based on Mahabali and her collaborators' research that looks at the AI metaphors. What
Hmm.
metaphors do people use to describe it? And so she'd heard the keynote, which was about a different topic, but then played the game. And she came up to me because I asked them, the game is called Go Somewhere.
Mm.
How you quote win the game. Everyone gets to win if everyone commits to one small action that they will take to move forward in whatever path they're on. So I don't ask them that they have to follow my own set of, where I think we ought to go, or, that kind of thing. So I just say it's a small commitment. It's a little yellow card and everybody fills out what's that one small action that you'll take. And she was so kind. She said, "Oh, it's been so great having you here. I loved hearing you talk. And this has just been so fun." This was her very gentle criticism. "I just thought you would tell me what to do, and I'm disappointed." And I think she said exactly what to do, which, yeah, a little nuance there. And then the second interaction is with a dear friend. So I actually wasn't an interaction that I had. It was an interaction that other colleagues had, but I know this person very well. I've considered him to be a friend for many decades now, someone with whom I admire immensely on their teaching ability. So I don't want this secondhand paraphrased sentiment to at all reduce the power of the transformative power of this person's teaching over decades and decades. But the way that this has been shared with me is that the colleague said, just frustrating. So many of us are frustrated, right? Bryan said, "I don't want to sit in conversations about how to get students not to cheat with AI. I also don't want to be told that I have to change how I've been teaching successfully for
Mm.
decades." And I'm sure I didn't get it right because I wasn't there for this, but this is the spirit of the sentiment. So, in terms
Mm.
of those two reactions, I'd like you to assume the best, because I do. I assume the best of both of these people. So if we assume the best and we can tap into like the struggles, the challenges, just how it's like knocking around our sense of identity and purpose, how might you respond to either both of them collectively, or if you'd like to take them one by one? I'm game either way.
Well, I'd like to take them one by one. The first one is one I've been hearing for, I want to say, since the 1990s, when some academics confront digital technology and they think that this does not require a lot of deep thinking and practice and reflection on my part, or that they can't justify the time for this. I remember hearing one college provost tell an audience at EDUCAUSE that campus IT should be like toilet paper. It was necessary, but it shouldn't be seen in public, and people shouldn't make a big deal about it. I'm not sure she really impressed the audience very much there at that institution, but there are good reasons for the second part of not being able to devote the amount of time to dive into this. I mean, we think about right now, depending on the institution, the multiple pressures that are on faculty right now. That they're concerned about their profession. It might be a field like, well, it might be a field like computer science. It might be a field like women's studies or Chicano studies. They might be an institution which is suffering financially. And until this year, that would have been institutions that tended to be marginal or lower ranked. But now this year, this includes the elites as well. Just today, I was reading that Yale's provost announced that they are contemplating layoffs in the next year. This is one of the most one of the richest universities in the world, and they're contemplating this. And then it depends again on the person. They may have lost loved ones. They might have suffered physical damage. They may have suffered other damages during COVID, for which they have, not yet to recover. They may have long COVID, for example. They may be of a gender or racial or religious minority that, again, depending on where you are, that is suffering from persecution. They may also be an institution which is responding to its crises with a shift away from faculty governance. It may be one that has increased the amount of work that faculty have to do. It may be that's decreased the support they have, and so on. I mean, there's quite a few reasons to not be able to have the time to think about this. But unfortunately, AI is this complex and also this kind of orthogonal to what we've been doing. I mean, some earlier technologies we could fit into previous situations. We could say, okay, well, Wikipedia is an encyclopedia, and we've had encyclopedias for 200 plus years. We know how to handle that. So that could fit in a little bit. You could take a look at the learning management system, which didn't do anything new on itself. What it did was it put a bunch of tools like discussion boards all in one box. The AI is in many ways something which we haven't really done before in higher education. The AIs before LLMs were very thin on the ground, and often, at research or experimental stages. A lot of people that used AI outside of education either weren't aware of it or didn't connect it. So people playing computer games, for example, or using Google before Gemini or Bard. And I think we really have to be in that stage where we have to be able to think carefully about this. Um, One of the ways I view AI is that it's an alien, in literal sense, from Latin for the other. It's another form of thinking. It's another form of organizing information, and that we have to treat it seriously as such. The computer scientist Decay actually recommends that we think about generative AI as children. These are AIs that have some degree of autonomy, and they're also not very wise in the world yet, and we have to train and rear them up. I mean, these are all very demanding ways of going ahead. But I would also say that nobody says that every faculty member at every institution has to be thinking and planning through all the strategic ways that the world intersects with their institution. And one of the reasons we join institutions is to outsource some of that thinking. So we don't, an individual professor of history or biology doesn't have to do HR. They hire someone for that. They don't have to do marketing or outreach. We have a registrar, provost, and communications team for that, and so on. So I think in many ways it's up to a college or university to facilitate conversations about this, to bring in professional development, to bring in good speakers, to set up good resources and practices. Morgan State University, for example, with very few resources, actually is doing a tremendously ambitious job of grappling with AI. And they set up a repository of campus AI policies, not their own, but other campuses, which is a great tool for anybody to use. To have a teaching and learning center, to have the provost arrange for workshops or tea times so that people can have these conversations and do it in an environment that is welcoming and supportive of multiple views, so that people who are critical don't feel they're marginalized, people who are curious don't feel they're marginalized, and so on. I think that's really important to do. So the second one, their second story, your second anecdote, to an extent, we've been down that road before. This is the faculty member who says, "Why should I change the successful practices I've been using for decades?" I mean, you could think about people who have had to change for non-technological reasons. If, for example, they changed the institutions, or if they had to teach a seminar or a lecture when they were used to doing one and not the other. But also, we've had technological changes that shifted this. From web publishing of all kinds, from WordPress to HTML and to the LMS, to dealing. I mentioned Wikipedia, which I still hear controversies about, which I find charming in a way. Thinking about mobile devices, do you permit these in the classroom? And if so, what do you do with them? How do you handle them so they yield the best possible pedagogical, outcomes? I mean, during COVID, I was talking to a professor at one university who told me she was happy to be online and teaching via video because she believed that the state government required her to lecture for 5 or 6 hours a week. And so she would do that in her classes normally, face to face. So she would just lecture that way on Zoom. And I said, "Well, you don't actually lecture 5 to 6 hours a week on Zoom." And she said, "Oh, yes, I do. The government says I have to." No government on earth says that. And she's no. sometimes these practices need to change. And in a sense, if a professor doesn't want to change, the world has already changed for them. What do you do when your students come to you already using AI in various ways and in various capacities? And if you turn your classroom into a Faraday cage, you just blot out all electronic devices, or you just, you prohibit them verbally, no laptops, no phones, only blue books, God help you. Even if you do all of that, the minute they leave their classroom, whip out their phones, you've got access to, 3, 4, 5G networks, and off you go to AI. So it's time to adjust to that. I mean, I know a lot of professors who aren't used to having a classroom that is not mostly white students. Well, you've got to change. You've got, as the times have shifted, as the demographics have changed. So I hope that we can, to fall back to our institutions, I hope that our colleges and universities can support faculty in doing this through professional development, like through the pod network, through teaching and learning centers, through professional development, through giving faculty grace in order to make, or to change as the times do.
You said sometimes practices need to change. What are a few ways that your practices have changed or are changing with this continued emergence of artificial intelligence?
Well, I can tell you, but my practices are a little unusual in that I teach an unusual program. So, just to back up, I teach some classes at Georgetown University's master's degree program called Learning Design and Technology. So, these are graduate students who are going to go on to work in, say, instructional design or educational technology, or they might just be applying those skills to some other purpose. For example, we've had a couple of students who work at think tanks. This is the Washington D.C. area. There are a lot of think tanks, and they want to basically not exactly teach online, but they want to use the skills of teaching online in order to better do their web presence, their digital work. We've had people who are professors. We've had students who are also staff, and they basically want to take a deep dive into learning design. So, and they're all ages, as young as 22 and as old as retirees, mostly international. And the whole program is actually very small. Last year was the biggest size class, a whopping 25. So, my own classes, 25 is the biggest, and the smallest would be, say, 6. So, it's unusual. It's a marginal case in this respect, and it's also very meta because the program is about learning design and technology. So, we talk about the stuff we're using. I'll rearrange our classroom has wonderful mobility. We can move all the furniture and everything. Great. So I'll rearrange it and ask the students, all right, what does this arrangement mean? What does this encourage for you as a student? And then if you're an instructor, how would you arrange the class, right? So when I show them policies about technology, including AI, to ask them, well, what do you think? I mean, what kind of AI policies have worked for you, or do you think would work? So we get meta about this. So given that caveat, one of the ways that I've changed, I think, is that I do a lot more small group work. Now, that might sound like overkill if I'm talking about classes that are small, a dozen students or so. But it's really interesting and productive to have students in groups of, say, 2 or 3 when they're working with AI, because it gives them a way to reflect with AI that is kind of offline, if you will. So 2 people are sitting down in front of Claude, and they get to talk about their experience. John Warner, I think you may have had your program, the writer, good friend, wonderful writer. And he recommended that nobody use AI alone. This is where I got the idea from. He said, it's too, I'm going to paraphrase here, it's too alluring and too insidious, I think. He's very, very critical of AI to do without a friend. And I thought, oh, this is actually interesting to have students do that. And then, of course, all the other benefits of group work, they each get to teach each other and they get to learn from their experiences and so on. So that's one thing. I guess a second thing is I do even more with simulations and games. So I've been teaching with games since the 1990s, and with simulations, I teach a class that's entirely about simulations games for learning. It's just one of the great tools that we can use to really enhance learning. And that's not necessarily digital games. We've had teaching and learning before the digital world, arguably going back a couple of millennia. Classical Rome, actually, we found that not only did they use board games for teaching people statecraft, but they also used simulated organs out of terracotta or out of porcelain to teach medicine. And so we have a lot of ways of doing this, and I enjoy doing that. So now with AI, it's much easier to have students say, ask a student to write a prompt, which will take them through a simulation exercise. So, Bonnie, did we talk about this when we were in San Diego? I can't remember if we did.
I don't think so. I'm not
Well,
recalling it, but I was so stimulated by the conversation. I kind of wish I had been taking notes voraciously like I am right now.
well, I had the same experience. I had the same experience. It was a very, very pleasant time. Well, one of the things I did that was a lot of fun was I went to Mexico City and was working with a few hundred academics in that country. And I was asking them what they were interested in. At the time, a lot of them were interested in space exploration. So, all right. So I whip up, ChatGPT and I ask it with a single prompt. It's just a paragraph, not a very complicated one. And ask it basically guide me through a simulated human expedition to the lunar surface. And I structured it so that it would ask me questions. It would give me choices that I would have to make. And it would respond to my choices and alter the world accordingly. So, how many astronauts do I want in my spaceship? What kind of fuel mixture? What kind of escape velocity? What kind of altitude? And I worked this crowd as we took them, all the way to lunar orbit. And I thought that the simulation was actually too easy and too kind. So I asked it to become a little more challenging. Immediately killed one of my astronauts, which was actually very frustrating.
No.
But so it was. Think of it as, if you want, older listeners, I'm afraid, will think of Choose Your Own Adventure books, which is a good example of that. You could think as well about interactive fiction or about Dungeons and Dragons, or you could think about any kind of simulation, like a tabletop simulation. And digital tools do this that quickly. I mean, really more quickly than it took for me to explain. And so I have students do that now, which I think is very powerful and effective. I guess the other thing that I do for this is I have students outside of class look for examples of AI and news about AI and bring that to class. Now, I teach with my wonderful colleague, Eddie Maloney. I teach a class on AI in education, but I do this elsewhere in my other seminars too, so that they can look in the world and look carefully for any experiences and bring them to class. So if they learn about a new bit of software, or a new controversy, a new use, they can bring it to class. So those are a couple of the changes I've done. But again, my teaching might just not be, maybe so far off the beam that it's not useful for anybody else.
What's underpinning it that feels so universal is ultimately wanting to find ways to make things be relevant. And the only ways
Hmm.
we can have things be relevant is when we give up some of our desire to control and then invite,
Mm.
what happens in the unexpected and in those liminal
Mm.
spaces as well. And this actually brings me perfectly to the recommendations segment, because what you were just talking about, and I'm so delighted that you shared that story. This can all feel so big. So my recommendation is you got to make it small. I invite you to think about one thing that students get confused about in your class. And you don't even have to plan this out in advance. You could actually just be like me this last semester and realizing one of the things that students get confused about in my class. I teach every year, and I have for many years, a class called Personal Leadership and Productivity. And one of the authors we draw from is David Allen. He wrote a book called Getting Things Done. And
Hmm.
one of the
Hmm.
things students get confused about is it's called and I'll link to it in the show notes, the Getting Things Done workflow diagram. But since you don't maybe want to go to your show notes right now, I'm going to describe it to you because all of you can relate to this. So we've got things coming at us. We've got text messages, we've got social media, we've got email, we've got all kinds of things that are coming into trying to grab for our attention. We also hopefully have ideas and dreams and hopes, big and small. And so what the GTD workflow diagram helps you do is to be able to, for everything that comes in, ask, what is this thing? Is it actionable? And then, broadly speaking, divide up, if it's not actionable, do I need it someday or not? Put it in the trash, or when might I need this to surface, if ever, reference system kind of thing. If it is actionable, maybe it's a calendar invite that gets added, or maybe it's a project, or maybe we delegated, etc. So students get confused about this all the time. And by the way, I shouldn't even narrow it down to students. Human beings get confused about this all the time
Hmm.
because a lot of
Hmm.
people never learned systems like this. So they don't even know what I'm talking about. What do you mean? Something comes at me and I pay attention to it right then because it's grabbing for my attention. And so I pay attention to it. And by the way, on my less quote unquote productive days, I do this too. I don't always carve out the discipline to stay focused on, what's really important in that moment. So I went to Canva Code. Canva now, and there's so many systems that will do this, for you. But the one that I happened to be tinkering with that day was within the graphic design website. My friend would really bristle at me calling it a graphic design, but for us novices, yes, sometimes we go to Canva. And so Canva Code, I asked it to make me a game to test out to help people just experience it. Because once you start doing it, then it makes perfect sense. Of course, you'd put that in your calendar. Oh, of course, it would make more sense to not try to do that thing. That's a really big thing. That's really a project that will have many steps taken over many months. And so I asked it to make the game. And at first, Bryan, it wasn't very good because if I tried to play it on a mobile phone or even on a browser and I tried to drag it off the screen, the game just stops or whatever. So I did have to iterate with it and et cetera. But I would just recommend, think of one thing. Don't think of 70 things. Think of one thing and just try it. Don't spend more than even 20 minutes trying it. Maybe it's a failed experiment, but that would be like a nice little thing to just try. Can I make this concept easier to understand through a game, through a simulation? And it's not as hard as it once was, but it's also not going to be perfect. So kind of be ready for that. Like, this may be a failed experiment, but guess what? You've experimented, and that can never be a failure because failure is data. So that's my first recommendation. And I will put a link to this game that I made in case any of you want to go try it out, just so you could kind of see what that experiment resulted in. So the second thing I want to recommend is that I recently took a workshop over 6 weeks with Harold Jarkey. It was on personal knowledge mastery. One of the things he encouraged us to do was to get on Mastodon, which I was there, but I wasn't really there. And he really wanted us to be there and actually engaging in community. And I met someone named, and when I say met, I mean through my use of the personal knowledge mastery hashtag. I met someone named Todd who has a wonderful AI playground that I'm going to link to. You want to talk about having fun, experimenting. This man is so funny. He is so playful. I'm finding myself just cracking up, but he's also not totally bought in. Like what Bryan was saying earlier, he's not like a zealot, like we should all just, sell all our goods and just go work for the AI gods. In fact, I think he describes himself as, I'm literally looking at the page right now. Let me read his words instead of mine. I am very skeptical and concerned about how AI will be used. It's interesting what it can do, but like the television, I have doubts that we will use it well. More likely, like we usually do with techno mumbo jumbo, we will relentlessly abuse it. And Bryan, over on the right-hand side, he has a screen grab of the movie WALL-E, where the characters are sitting in their comfy, cozy chairs, quite not moving around and just, experiencing life in their bubble. So anyway, I want people to go on Todd's AI playground and just go have some fun and some things that there's probably, 25 or 30 little links you could click on the left-hand side. I have not gotten through all of them, but boy, about halfway through, student surveys in song and other stuff. He took his anonymized student survey data and he put it in and Suno.com and asked it to write reggae songs for him. And I mean, Bryan, how many of us don't, just with the stress that we have and the difficulty sometimes of processing that kind of feedback, I'm over here laughing, I'm over here inspired, and also appreciative of the fact that he's not buying all this hook, line, and sinker. He does have a critical thought process, as he's going through all these things. But, he's actually the opposite of what we were talking about earlier. He's skeptical, but he's also seen this is emerging. And so I'm going to make my little playground I'm going to do some playing. I've also just delighted. I'll put a link if you'd like to follow him on Mastodon as well, because he's just been absolutely great to get to know a little bit. And I'm looking forward to continuing to get to know him as well. By the way, his background, he's in instructional design. So if you are also interested in instructional design, he's a great person there too. So I feel like I went on my recommendations so long, Bryan. I'm so sorry about that, but I'm so energized by all that you've shared. So I get to pass it over to you now to whatever you'd like to recommend.
Well, thank you. Those all sound really exciting. I'm always interested in a game for learning. I was going to recommend a person, an incredibly productive person named Adam Tooze, Tooze. He's a professor at Columbia, a British professor, specializes in historical economics, and he has now just become an extraordinary creator. So to begin with, he's written a whole series of great books, including a wonderful book on the great financial crisis of 2008. The reason I'm bringing it up here is because he creates two different Substacks, two different newsletters that are just incredibly detailed, where he will nerd out about political news, about economic news, always with an incredibly sharp eye, an incredible depth of data, but also reflecting through lots and lots of theory, of social theory, in ways that are incredibly approachable and understandable. And he will riff on anything from modern painting to banking problems in Japan to issues of railway gauges in Germany vis-a-vis German rearmament against Russia. And he'll do this with incredible speed, infectious enthusiasm, and always a good sense of humor and visual design. And a lot of that, but not the visual design, shows up in his podcast, which is called Ones and Twos, where he's interviewed by a colleague, and they just simply discuss news of the week, but in just remarkable detail. So the interlocutor will ask Hughes to talk about, say, the Ukraine war, or about Trump's tariff policies, or about issues with government stats. And he will just cut loose with just incredible energy, lots of enthusiasm, and great clarity, really making complex issues much more understandable. And with so much just breathtaking views on everything. He's very progressive, but not in ways that you might expect. And he's always very, very genial and often very funny. He had a story about the Canadian Prime Minister we met, which was really, really entertaining. But I find his newsletters always make me smarter. They always encourage me to be more curious about the world and to learn a great deal more. So I just unreservedly recognize and recommend Adam Tooze.
Thank you so much about sharing his work. And you're getting me curious just talking about him. So I can't wait to go check it out. That is one of my favorite things, is people who can make us more curious about the world, like you and like him, like this book. I really want to recommend that people head over to the show notes, or whatever way you'd like to find to get yourself to peak higher ed. It is one, I told Bryan before we started recording, it's one of those that just is so nourishing. It's challenging in the best ways. It's hopeful. There's so much. So I told him there was like 20 books there, in the sense of 20 conversations. We were just be getting started. So thank you for this rich contribution to our discourse on really important issues.
Well, thank you. I especially appreciate the chance to talk to you, because today is Friday, December 5th. Late yesterday, December 4th, I finally got to hold in my hands the first print copy of the book. So I'm still very just excited to see, years of research turn out in that, beautiful format. Johns Hopkins University Press did just a fantastic job in everything from editing, copy editing, design, and outreach. They're just a wonderful press, and it's a delight to work with them.
I was so privileged to get to read in advance a digital copy, but I got to tell you, I'm looking forward to getting my hands on the print copy as well, in the sense of there's kind of nothing like that. I mean, as an author, of course, Bryan, but even as a reader, there's just something that will always be different about that. So looking forward to that as well. Thank you for sharing that. That's wonderful. And congratulations on such a magnificent achievement.
Well, thank you for the very kind words, and also thank you for the opportunity to speak with you once more. Your podcast is always a nourishment to my soul, and I'm really glad and honored to have a chance to return to it.
Thanks, Bryan. Thanks once again to Bryan Alexander for being a guest on today's podcast and for this rich conversation. Thanks to each of you for listening to today's episode, which was produced by me, Bonnie Stachowiak. It was edited by the ever-talented Andrew Kroger, If you've been listening for a while and haven't signed up for the weekly update, head over to teachinginhighered.com/subscribe. You'll receive the most recent episodes, show notes, as well as some other goodies that go well beyond those notes. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time on Teaching in Higher Ed.